Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and those of you that are online as well. A larger crowd than I was anticipating, but I'm really happy to see everybody. So what I'm going to do, everybody can hear me okay. I have my water up here because I had a cough last week and I'm still getting over it. So I may, anyway, we'll hold my voice last through the whole thing. What I want to do tonight is just kind of give a status report and update on what we've found, what we've learned, a little bit of a history of what we've done at the site. Because of course, a lot of you are residents, most of you are residents on the site, America's first neighborhood, as I believe some of you initially talked about. Yeah, I love that. I mean, anyway, it's earlier than St. Augustine. Of course, St. Augustine actually lasted, but I'll go over that in a moment. One point I want to make is that little picture I've shown a lot of times, it's from Codex Osuna. And thanks to Cristina Balti and her work on the Aztecs in her master's thesis, we kind of together came up with the idea that, and if you look at the flag, it's not, I always thought it was Tristàn de Luna marching with soldiers, but look at the flag. That's the Aztecs. That's an eagle on a cactus. And it's in a page that talks about the Aztecs who went. And we've got a document that says that the guy who led them was Don Miguel, right? Anyway, so that's just the point that's probably Don Miguel, an Aztec, Christian Aztec, who's leading his people from downtown Mexico City on the Luna expedition to Florida. So it's kind of nifty. Something I hadn't realized before, but Cristina and I came up with it at some point, and I wanted to highlight that. Anyway, the rest of it, of course, is Emmanuel Point, which is where we're going to be talking about. I think I just click on this, and then it will, whoa, it will work. Okay, I'm good. Good. Yep. All right. Just as a very brief background, because I'm going to mainly talk about, obviously, the Luna settlement in East Pensacola Heights, but I want to at least set it up. In terms of colonizing Florida, we are indeed earlier than St. Augustine, but we're not the first, in a sense. What you'll see here is that after Florida was discovered, Juan Ponce de Leon actually attempted a settlement down here, 1521. Nobody's ever found that archaeologically, and he didn't last long. He was shot by Calusa Indians, and eventually they withdrew, and he died in Havana a little while later. He was buried there, and later his body was transferred to San Juan. The next settlement attempt was 5 years later on the Georgia coast somewhere, we think. Again, that has not been found. That's a town called San Miguel de Gualdape, 1526. So those are two attempted settlements that predate the Luna expedition as well, but we don't know where they are. And indeed, we may never find them because they were very short-lived. The Arellano settlement only lasted maybe 6 weeks. But the Luna settlement, the Tristàn de Luna settlement, which we'll talk about, of course, it was in 1559. Had it succeeded, it would have been the first successful Spanish city. But of course, it wasn't. It was an abject failure after 2 years. However, the next, of course, was Pedro Menendez, which started the East Coast Atlantic settlement of Florida, which relegated Pensacola and West Florida to sort of, anyway, inattention for about 137 years until they finally came back and realized it was important when the French started knocking on the back door. But that's another story again. Anyway, why were they going to be doing this in the first place? Mexico City, of course, was where all the gold and silver, where the coins, at least the silver coins, were being minted. And that was the head of the viceroyalty, the vice king. And it had a route to San Juan de Ulúa, which is the port, modern-day Veracruz. And of course, Havana was an important city as well. And the reason these were all important is because all the silver and gold and all the main northern Spain, New Spanish treasures and all of that, all the goods that were being produced in the Indies went by that maritime route. So what's the problem with that route? All the fleets converged in Havana and then tried to make it out through the Bahama Straits or the Bahama Channel out before hurricane season. And they didn't always make it. If they tried to sail too late and a hurricane caught them, you know, there's several whole fleets that went down. So they knew this at this time. That system started as early as 1540. So what the king had ordered was that he wanted the Spanish to settle at Santa Elena, which was a spot that had been visited in 1526 by the Arellano expedition, or at least the recon for it. And so the viceroy found out that the king wanted to settle Santa Elena. So the viceroy of New Spain in Mexico City decided that he would plan it out so that eventually he would have an overland route. So all of the silver and all of the risky things that might go down in a fleet here could go by land, and eventually could be disembarked or embarked on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean at Santa Elena, which is currently At this time, it would have been about where Hilton Head, South Carolina is. However, when Pedro Menendez went up and found a spot and then called it Santa Elena, it was at Paris Island. So the actual settlement of Paris Island postdates the Luna expedition by about, what, 7 years. But Luna did not make it that far. So what was the Luna expedition like? This was the landscape that they were anticipating going to. And this is the route that took them to Ochuse. So 12 ships, 11 under their own power, came to Pensacola Bay to set up shop and start this big military penetration of the interior. So there was an army, and then there were about 1,000 hangers-on, families and people, servants, slaves. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about these people later. But as soon as they arrived, well, about 5 weeks after they arrived, of course, a hurricane struck, which absolutely wiped out the fleet at anchor. And they had already offloaded the people and all the equipment and everything else, except the most important thing, they were going to wait until they built a warehouse that was watertight, because, of course, Pensacola gets a lot of rain. So they kept all the food, 1 million pounds of corn and all that, sitting on the ships until they got a really safe place. And, of course, the hurricane came and wiped it out. September 19th in the night, and it lasted for 24 hours. And at the end, there had been 10 ships at anchor. There were only 3. So most of the food went down. 1,500 people were now, stranded. So over the next 2 years, we saw somewhere. Whoa, sorry. There we go. Several expeditions. They went to Havana to get food. They went inland eventually, and they went to a native town called Nanipacana, tried to get food from the Native Americans who had experienced the violence of De Soto's expedition 20 years earlier, and basically said no thanks, and evacuated, and actually then took their food, cut all the plants and crops and even the wild foods the Spanish could use, and basically tried to starve them out. And they sent another group up to Coosa, but that's literally the extent of the Luna expedition. They never made it to the Atlantic coast. But that's not our story. That's just to sort of set it up. What I really want to focus on is the actual settlement they established. The king didn't want the Pensacola established settlement. The king wanted Santa Elena. But the first step in getting that was Pensacola as a beachhead. And that's what they actually set up. So this is what I call the Luna Archaeological District. All 4 known Luna sites are within that yellow circle. So, of course, we have the terrestrial settlement up on the East Pensacola Heights on the high bluff top and extending down to the bayou. And then we have 3 shipwrecks. The first was found in 1992. That's the zone where those 3 shipwrecks are. The second was found in 2006. And then the third was found the year after we found the Luna settlement in 2016. Because now that once we knew where the settlement was, the other 2 ships were offshore, we thought, oh, gee, let's start surveying in between the settlement and the wrecks, and sure thing, a ship came up. So we have Emmanuel Point 1, Emmanuel Point 2, and Emmanuel Point 3 shipwrecks. And they've been diving on that literally, I think, this last week. So we have teams out there actually working on the shipwrecks. But what was the Luna settlement? It was called Santa Maria de Ochuse. Ochuse was the native name for this bay. De Soto's lieutenant had discovered it in 1539, but the name stuck. The Ochuse were gone, as far as we know, by the time Luna arrived. Anyway, they brought 1,500 people or so. I now have a really detailed idea of the soldiers because we just got new documentation as of February, I think it is. All the account records from Mexico City that they financed the expedition with, we now have. And no previous researcher has ever published or found anything on it. So it's like, it's an amazing discovery. And I'm still working on it, but I'll drop some little bits and pieces of what we've discovered. And in addition to 546 Spanish soldiers, we had about 100 Aztec warriors. Again, these were Christian Aztec, dressed like Spanish soldiers, but still Aztecs. Or Aztecs, they were Mexican Indians from Santiago Tlatelolco and from Tenochtitlan, which is the literal downtown of Mexico City. Some Dominican missionaries who were intending to convert the native population. They actually brought back 5 Florida Indian women, Native Americans who had been on the De Soto expedition, were brought out as prisoners, as slaves, brought out, survived, were sent to Guatemala, and eventually the Dominicans, being missionaries, found out about them and brought them back to Mexico City and housed them in Mexico City. So when the Dominicans came as the missionaries, they brought 5 actual Florida Indian women who hadn't been home for 20 years. One had married a Mexican Indian man. and another one brought her 2 sons along on this expedition. So they brought them back to Florida to act as interpreters, guides, etc. One of them was even from the Battle of Mobila, from the site called Mobila up in Alabama. So she probably spoke Muskogean Creek and very likely would have been their primary interpreter, because nobody, of course, on the expedition probably knew any of these languages. Anyway, lots of other people along as well, but basically they were there to set up a town. Had 100 lots were planned at least for 100 heads of household, and then 40 additional lots for an administrative district, a plaza, a church, a royal warehouse, all of that. We'll move along here, make sure my time is good. Okay. The Luna settlement was settled by 1,500 people, but its population fluctuated quite wildly. The point is, of course, originally their plan was set up the settlement, and then 550 soldiers or so would move inland quickly and go towards South Carolina, toward the Atlantic coast. They never made it out, of course. So the wiping out of the food, the loss of the ships, left the soldiers stranded. And then all of those people, all those 1,500 mouths were trying to eat, of course. And they didn't get relief supplies. Let's see, it was between September and December. So that would be 3 months. So it took them 3 months to even get additional relief supplies after they lost all their food. So what they did was they eventually moved inland after the first relief ship supplies were exhausted. They moved inland, so you see that big drop in the population, but they never abandoned it. They left 100 soldiers and some enslaved Africans. Then they came back once they figured out that they couldn't survive in the interior, and then they started sending people away. People who were sick, people who were not that useful for the expedition. They needed less mouths, and so they started sending people away. And then finally, the people that had lived up in Coosa in Northwest Georgia for about 6 months finally came back. Anyway, it eventually dwindled. So that's one of the things that's about the Luna expedition site, that's a settlement that we as archaeologists have to figure out is, how did a large site, the biggest 16th century site in all of the continental United States, there is no larger site, even St. Augustine is smaller because he had a lot of people, but over time it diminished in size. So where did they continuously live and where did they abandon? Like there's parts of the site, the big site, that were only occupied maybe for 5 months, and then it got smaller and smaller and smaller. Did they concentrate around one area? Did they spread them out a little bit? The Native Americans were were attacking them, and so they probably concentrated. So from an archaeological standpoint, what I'm going to show you at least, it may have started out in one configuration, but it ended up contracting and becoming basically a small survivors camp. And eventually, the last 6 months or so, they brought in a new replacement garrison company under an old soldier named Diego de Biedma, and he stayed there with soldiers who hadn't even been on the expedition, and they stayed sitting in this camp for about 5 or 6 months. So the point is, it makes it kind of messy to interpret the site since it didn't last. Another big thing that we're focusing on, or I'm focusing on, is that the initial idea was to set up a town. And this is how the Spanish set up their towns in the 16th century. Nice grid patterns with a central plaza. And of course, that's a sketch of a 16th century town elsewhere. That's not the Luna settlement. But the idea at least is that that's what they were aiming for. And they had 5 weeks to hack down, palmettos and basically lay out the spot and start building the warehouse and everything else. But they had 550 soldiers that were going to go inland very, very quickly. So there was also this gigantic army camp that initially, at least, was not planned on staying that long. So they had tents and everything else that would be for mobile residents. So as soon as the hurricane, of course, occurred, they actually added a couple hundred soldiers or sailors who had survived the fleet, the wrecking of the fleet. And so all of a sudden they had all these people, and I don't know how far they went on making the town, like continuing to build the town, because eventually nobody wanted to be there except Luna. They all rebelled against him, and he eventually sentenced all of his officers to death, but said that the viceroy would have to confirm those sentences. So he never, of course, did anything about it. But he was very isolated, and he also started behaving very oddly, and he may have had some sort of disease. We're good. Okay. Yes. Sorry, just trying to find. This is taking its sweet time. Oh, all right. Sorry. There we go. Okay. There. One of the things we're trying to look for archaeologically is wooden structures, right? If we're looking for tents, we're probably not going to find much. But for the big structures they actually did build, we're looking for stuff like this. We're looking for wooden posts, plank walls, nails, rows of nails in the walls, these nice wrought iron nails, which we do find all over the site, thatched roofs. So this would leave a footprint in the ground. So we're looking for evidence of that, undisturbed evidence for post holes, and then also distributions of nails that might tell us, for example, wall lines, areas where larger buildings where you might have bigger fasteners, bigger nails, and then small structures you might not have any. They might use pegs. Anyway, this is a 16th century town in South Carolina. This is Santa Elena. It was established in 1566, and it was dug by Stan South beginning, I think, in 1979 or 80. So this site is a 16th century site, 20 years older, or later rather. But you can see that this is what they set up in the way of wooden structures. And if you clear away some of the background noise, you can see that. So that is a pattern for a 16th century set of wooden houses inside Spanish Florida. So basically, the point is, these are small post in-ground structures. The spacing between the posts is pretty wide, like 10 feet. So if you dig a 6 by 6 foot unit, you're never going to get more than one post, which makes it hard to find lines of posts. Anyway, from an archaeological standpoint, it means it's going to take us a while to sort of piece together, hopefully, structures. But we're on our way. I'll show you in a moment. And then they also would have had little plazas, and hopefully they would all be oriented with respect to the orientation of the streets and the grid. But again, we don't know. Did they continue building the town, or did they basically just enter survival mode and build whatever the heck occurred to them, knowing that they would all eventually return home, or hoping at least? Okay, so this site is not, we weren't the first to identify the site. It first shows up, the archaeological site known as S8 ES1. That's 8 for Florida, ES for Escambia County, and 1 for the very first site listed in our county. There's a map that shows native occupation via some sand domiciliary mounds, as they were described. Then Gordon Willey, an archaeologist, visited in 1940, went up the bluff, looked and found some pottery sherds out of some dark soil, and said there were no mounds. And then in 1986, Dr. Judy Bentz, doing what was a survey of the general area.
It's a city-owned property and rights of way.
There you go. But shovel testing was conducted on the site, which revealed that there was a site, and basically, but at that time, at least, Spanish colonial studies about 16th century material culture had not really progressed that far. So sand-tempered olive jar looked basically identical, little pieces of it, to sand-tempered Native American pottery. And so if you don't find any absolute diagnostics, you go with the basic, and so it took a little while longer for us to identify it. But still, that was part of the UWF work. And then in 2015, this was discovered accidentally by a former graduate, I believe, anyway, of our program, who found artifacts on the surface, which are there, just to show you those. That's literally the collection of artifacts that were found on the surface of the ground in the big triangular lot right there in the center of the site. And what makes this unique is not that we're Spanish artifacts and native artifacts, but that the olive jar rim and this piece of Spanish majolica are 16th century. And there is no other place in the entire Pensacola Bay area that should have 16th century pottery except the Luna settlement. And of course, we had the shipwrecks literally just right offshore. So Emmanuel Point, East Pensacola Heights has long been in the radar in terms of like the settlement might be here. But it took that discovery to make it, something that we could eventually prove and demonstrate that it really was. Back up though, from 2016 to 2024, UWF has done basically almost annual field schools in the summer. I'll show you some pictures from them, and lots of monitoring and mitigation work, all of which pretty much was funded out of the Archaeology Institute right here. And Dr. Benchley was heading up the institute at that time. So the point is that we've got this massive site. We've been doing extensive work funded through the institute, carried out by students in the Department of Anthropology, and that's in concert with archaeologists working underwater out at the shipwrecks as well, usually simultaneously. So we can be on the dig site and look out and see the boats out there and kind of wave to them from a distance. It's kind of nifty. Okay, just to show you, this is literally the first time in November 2015 when we found it. Just to show you we did 70 shovel tests under a single house lot, which is a lot of holes in the ground. And they're just little grab samples. We sift it and find artifacts like that. Those are trade beads that would have been brought by the Spanish to give away to the Native Americans. So a lot of them did make it in the interior, but we have actually quite a concentration of them at the site. So they're the ones that didn't get given away. And by the way, one of the reasons we dug at that spot is because when you find things on the surface of the ground, it doesn't necessarily belong to what's below ground. It could have been fill dirt brought in from somewhere else. So we did some excavations and found 16th century artifacts right there in pits, features we call them, below the ground, which I'll talk more about later. So anyway, we proved that the artifacts did belong to the area, and we were able eventually to make this big announcement that we had found the Luna settlement. Very shortly thereafter, in the spring of 2016, we decided that we would, where a house was about to go up, we would use a backhoe and try to scrape off the surface layer to get down to where post hole patterns would be. And I'll show you how that works momentarily. We did this, and we didn't know as much about the site as we do now. If we did, I wouldn't have let them dig as deep as they did. It's like we said 50 centimeters, and most of the deposits go down to 35. But the post holes always go down to 70 centimeters, about 2 feet. So theoretically, we got to the right zone for finding structures, and we did find a few features. Anyway, that's just some of our students. This is kind of an all hands on deck situation. Everybody was so excited, and the neighbors were eager for us to come visit at their property. And anyway, it's been quite a wild ride. Very, very proud of what UWF and the local community has done over the last, 8 years, 9 years? Anyway, long time, 9 years almost. And these are field crew photos of all of our students and staff working on the field schools. So these are UWF students, undergrads and grads from 2016, 17, 18, 19. Then we skipped the COVID year, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And we didn't do it last year because, well, we have to take a break and actually start writing some of this stuff. So you can't keep digging and not writing and analyzing. So, and we got a grant to do that. So that was this summer. Just some shots. These are what we call block excavations. Shovel test is just digging a 50 by 50 centimeter hole in the ground at like 10-meter intervals, 10 yards or so. This is sitting down and doing like a 2-meter or even bigger units, looking for post hole patterns, looking for everything in context, not just a grab sample, going down carefully in layers, peeling off the humus layer and then the top of the midden layer, midden being the debris field, the dark soil associated with the Luna settlement. Anyway, that's just some of our students working. Just to show you some of our excavations, these are some of the excavations from 2016 that were done down near the water. Another set of excavations were done in some in 16, but 17 and 18, a large number actually altogether. Pardon me. Another set of excavations that we were at most recently, where by the way, these are color coded by year. The total number of square meters we've dug on the site is, I think I ran the numbers, it's 583 square meters. Guess how much of the site that we've actually dug? Because it's a 32-acre site. Anyway, we have dug 0.39% of the total site. So not even half of 1%. And yet everything I'm going to talk about here is based on the results of that careful sampling, systematic sampling. My point is, I guess there's a lot left out there, and we, hope that we can, over the years, accumulate more and learn more. Oh yeah, that's just another set. That's a big, dense cluster, which I'll show you in a moment. We have a lot of post holes in. All right, so this is an example of a block unit that has 3 post holes in it. Big 4 by 4 meter unit. We almost never dig them this big, but we got ambitious one year. And in this case, we actually finished it down to the very bottom. What you're seeing up top is dark soil on the top. That's the stuff associated with the organics, the forest, and obviously the human beings who were here that eventually, human beings generate lots of mess and garbage. Where they live, the soil gets dark. And so it sort of percolates down, but then you get to the subsoil, which is that yellow color, that yellowish, orangish colored soil. But you see 3 spots in there that are post holes, which we bisected with little square holes that we use to get the profile of the post holes and to, of course, excavate the contents. So these are patterns. Some are better than others. These are all the post holes we've identified in a couple of our lots. And what you'll note is that the one on the right there, lot 21, a lot of post holes. In fact, beautiful post holes. We've got one of them right in the center there that had big slabs of olive jars jammed inside the post to hold the post up. A nail I think it was probably originally in the post itself. And lots of other things. We've got radiocarbon date that's in the 16th century. I mean, it's a Luna post through and through. And some of the sherds mended, some of the pot sherds mended with other stuff that was scattered around on the surface. Anyway, the point though is that that is sort of like a shotgun blast. I can't tell that there's a rectangular, a circular, a D shape, whatever. I can't tell what kind of structure is. But the reason for that may be that they built two or three times over the course of the years. Like one time the hurricane, they built a structure and then the hurricane knocked it over, and then they built another structure. And you know, and then maybe a post rots out and they decide to expand. And the point is, it doesn't look like much of a pattern. However, this one, the one that I showed you a minute ago, the big photograph, that's a 4x4 meter unit in the top. And if you note, there's several, the distances between those on the north-south line are exactly half the distance between the two on the east-west line. So it could fit, and this is a pure hypothetical idea of the structure. Now, we know a little bit about this area in that inside this potential structure between the post holes, we don't find many, we find artifacts, but we don't find much in the way of shell debris or food, etc. But on the east side of that wall, and actually on the north side of this possible wall as well, we found shell debris. These are shell midden deposits. Basically, what they are is the food remains of what the Luna settlers ate. We've got Spanish and Aztec pottery below the shells, in the shells, and above the shells. And they're all intact. And we have a student, a grad student who's actually doing their thesis on this. We did special analysis, did water screening, and so the shell neutralizes the acidity, and we ended up with amazing bone preservation. So we've got all the fish and terrestrial mammals. We've got, I think there's gar and black drum and hardhead catfish, of course, lots of different shell types. So literally we're seeing what were the Spaniards who were starving, who didn't have their normal diet of wheat bread and olive oil and, you know, oranges or whatever. And they're eating shellfish and bottom feeders from Pensacola Bay, from an environment they didn't know anything about. We even have one fish hook that we found. So, you know, they came prepared. Anyway, the point, and lots of fishing nets. We found a lot of rolled lead nets from seine nets, which we would use to walk out in the shallows and catch fish. Anyway, artifacts. We found a tremendous number of artifacts. You know what? I don't even know what the number is, but many, many thousands of artifacts of a range of types. I think the majority by count would have to be ceramics, pottery, broken pottery, because, for example, one olive jar, one big Spanish olive jar, which carried wine or vinegar, if it broke, based on the size of the ones we have and based on the weight of whole olive jars, each olive jar could break and create 770 sherds. So we've only found like 2,500 sherds of olive jar across the whole site. So, I mean, they're all from a bunch of different ones, but they theoretically could make up only what, 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that. But anyway, the point is that most of our debris is the debris of daily life. So you see pottery, plates, majolica, which is a type of tin enameled pottery with typically blue painted designs on white. We see cookwares, which are the red ceramics, lead glaze. They'd use those big pots and casserole dishes. They'd be cooking on them. There's Aztec pottery. Now you may say that, oh, well, that must mean the Aztec Indians were using it. But in actuality, the Aztec pottery, based on the thesis that Christina Volti has put together, is distributed all across the site. And the fanciest Aztec pottery co-occurs with the fanciest Spanish pottery. So literally, these are all Spaniards living in Mexico City. So, of course, the markets are full of Aztec pottery. So they use Aztec wares in their own households. So when they came to Florida, they brought Spanish and Aztec pottery. And we've got it all over the site. I say that, it's a small distribution, but I'll show you that. There's a few other things in here. The crossbow on the bottom, these are crossbow bolt tips. Crossbows were used as weapons of war until right about 1570 in Europe. And after that, the firearm, the gun, replaced it, of course. But Luna's expedition was one of the last expeditions to actually use crossbows. Pedro Menendez used them in East Florida, but again, quickly abandoned them. And the neat thing about these is we do have some iron crossbow bolt tips. I think now we have 3. I'm only picturing 1 there. But we've got, I think, total of 7 other crossbow bolts that are made of copper. Copper, which is soft and malleable, which would not work against European armies and metal plate armor. So those were actually made, we believe, and we have documents to suggest this, that they're made by Mexican Indians for, at least certainly of Mexican copper. So they're made in the New World and they're made for use in the New World. So that we have a lot of those. They're on the Coronado expedition in the Southwest too. And one of my favorite artifacts up there is the little bitty horsey over there. We called it Mystery. Well, the person who found it called it Mystery. It's a little brass horse on a chain. It's a pendant, but it was gilt. There's not much left, but it's still a nifty little, it may have even been a male or female, but it's definitely a piece of jewelry that was classic and typical in that time period. Little bitty star there is made out of actually silver, little sheet silver, but it was used on we think, these things were used on flails, penitential flails. So as a part of Catholic piety in the medieval period, people would use knots at the end of flails, and a few of them would add little things to make it bleed. They wouldn't put a lot of them, but 3 or 4, and we found inventories to talk about it. So, all right. Anyway, there's other artifacts that are amazing in there, but you see chainmail, grinding stones made of basalt from Mexico, which we found in a number of locations on the site. Anyway, let's proceed. This is where we've dug. So all of these represent shovel tests, and you can't really make it out too well, but in there are also outlines in color for all of the excavation units we've done. So we've dug all over the place, and some of these, by the way, are in the site and some are outside the site. That's actually the whole purpose of that big shovel test survey. You dig close interval shovel tests, 10-meter intervals when you can, with permission of all the landowners that were willing. And then from that, we were then able to create a map that shows where those artifacts that were 16th century were located and where they stopped. So I'll show you that momentarily here. So for what I'm going to show you, this is in GIS, Geographic Information System software, and that's a fishnet. It just basically boxes. They're 50 by 50 meters. So each one of them is what? 6/10 of an acre, basically. So within that, this is all Spanish native and Spanish, Aztec, and local native artifacts that date to the Luna period. This is literally the shadow of the debris field that relates to the Luna expedition. So it's really big. Some of these occasionally, like the ones that are way off on the side, may be coarse earthenwares that possibly could date to later time periods that we can't necessarily distinguish at this point, but most of these are classic diagnostics. So let me show you real quickly. I'll just walk through these fairly swift. These are Spanish and Aztec only. So back here is Native American pottery added in. And by the way, the reason there's Native American pottery on this site is that the Spaniards also raided local villages that had been abandoned and brought back pots full of food and started using the actual native pots. So the native pottery here was made by Native Americans, but it was utilized and selected by the Spanish. So it's kind of a weird assemblage. Anyway, that's another topic that yet another student is working on a thesis for. So this is what we do. We go out and we gather data, and then we train students to do this kind of research by letting them work on this data. Anyway, it's great. We've had several generations of students now start to produce results and go into their careers with this in their background. All right, so anyway, this is Spanish Aztec diagnostics only. This is Spanish ceramics. That's density. That is sherds or pieces of pottery per meter squared. So it goes up to, you know what, I can't see it, but
We can't either.
yeah, 76, I think, is the highest thing. So 76 per square meter, pretty dense. Anyway, this is Spanish majolica tableware. So they would not use this in cooking or storage. It would literally be used for dining. So the distribution of dining ware tells us something about where they're eating, living and eating. At least that's where they're throwing this stuff away. This is lead glazed coarse earthenware. That's cookware. So this shows where they're cooking and breaking the pots that they cook on. And by the way, cookware tends to break a lot more than any other kind of pottery because they're using it over fire. So that's why we don't use a lot of cooking pots that are ceramic nowadays. This is unglazed coarse earthenware. That's just another kind of cookware probably, but also things that carried water and pitchers and serving dishes and things that weren't necessarily glazed. This is Spanish olive jar, the big amphora style olive jars that were used to carry, initially to carry wine and vinegar and olive oil and a range of other commercial products. But when they were empty, the Spaniards used them for carrying water around and for, a lot of different things. They could even store things like turpentine and whatever else they wanted. But you notice something, by the way, you notice how similar these all are to each other? They all overlap. That's because they're all part of the same assemblage. So go back, all the same. That's the whole assemblage. Well, no, that is. And you tease it apart, and they're all in the same areas. Anyway, this is olive jar. Here we go. This is Aztec. That's the distribution of Aztec pottery. So that shows that it's not just one little specific area. And it, again, the fanciest stuff is directly in association with the Spanish tableware. So you go into a Luna household, go into Luna's house and walk in there, and he's going to have some Spanish majolica, and some of the pitchers, however, will be Aztec, and some of the, maybe some of the bowls for serving. So again, it's Spaniards probably using it, and I imagine the Aztecs as well, but this is what we're seeing. This is Native American ceramics that are almost certainly Luna, well, probably Luna. By the way, it's hard to tell precisely, like I can say it's late prehistoric, and it's consistent with 16th century, but could it be 15th century? That's hard to distinguish. But this is the stuff that is likely to be Luna. This is the stuff that could be Luna, but it also could be earlier time periods. Because the Native Americans definitely used the bluff edge. We find prehistoric, pre-European settlements up there along the bluff edge near the water, because they're down there fishing. But there is no village. In fact, Judy, we've talked about this. There's really no good evidence for large village-sized native settlements in this late prehistoric period in the whole Pensacola Bay system. They're little bitty settlements. They're living inland and they're moving down to the coast during the summers and fishing, and at least that's what seems to be going on. So this settlement used native pottery, and it represents a huge splash of native ceramics, but not brought here by Native Americans. It was brought there by Spaniards and used during the 2 years they were here. Non-ceramic artifacts, everything that's other than pottery. This is all Luna stuff. Get through this pretty quickly here. Wrought iron fasteners. That means, not machine cut or wire nails. This is the hammered nails. And so this is all the wrought iron fasteners, and includes spikes. We have one spike that's as big as your forearm, which probably came off one of the ships that wrecked, and they just pulled it and used it on shore. A lot of standard nails. So this is all the wrought iron. I should point out that down in the lower left here, there is a British and second Spanish ranch or hacienda that was there later. So some of the wrought iron might belong to that later time period there, but it's hard to say. This is unquestionably 16th century, unquestionably Luna. These are what we call carrot head nails. And I don't mean like Bugs Bunny carrot. I'm talking carrot, like the symbol over a letter. Anyway, that's a carrot head nail, and they are universally thought to be horseshoe nails. As odd as it seems, I can't find any other conclusion. But anyway, the point is these things are all over the southwest of the United States, and they're all directly associated with the Coronado expedition in 1540 to 42. Why is that significant? Guess who was one of the captains of cavalry and the Maese de Campo, the head field master during the Coronado expedition? Tristàn de Luna y Arellano. So literally Luna was on the expedition that carried these things out to the southwest, and it was mostly horseback. And then when he came to Florida, he brought a supply of this for the half cavalry that was here. Anyway, all right, so those are unquestionable. And by the way, the densest concentration of those is up at the northeast side of the site, right on the edge of the site. And it's downwind, like prevailing winds come out of the southwest to the northeast. And you can imagine that if you're going to corral your horses, and if you're going to use them to go into the interior, like you don't need them down in the village, you put them up on the northwest side. So my guess is that somewhere on the, not far from Domino's, is going to be the corral for the horses. I should say they brought 240 horses on the ships. They took so long to get here that 120 of them died, and they chucked them over the side. So they ended up with actually a lot less horses than they thought, which may mean that these nails were probably repurposed and used for a lot of different things. I mean, you can tack an announcement up on a wall using one of these things. So, arms and armor, chainmail, brigandine, which is plate armor, overlapping plates sewn into a leather or felt, doublet, like a vest. Whoa, what the hell happened? Sorry. Here we go. Arms and armor, and also crossbow bolts, lots and lots of lead shot, meaning buckshot, bird shot, but also 50 caliber arquebus shot, the matchlock muskets, which is what they used at the time. And therefore, that's the back again to the original. So this is the distribution of 16th century artifacts. This is the Luna settlement. We've published on this and said that the site was about 32 acres. But based on continuing analysis and relooking at all this stuff, I suspect the site's actually kind of bigger than that. This is much more than 32 acres. So it's probably, it might even approach 40 acres or something. Now, not all of this is necessarily the core of the site. This is an old hypothetical schematic that I've done. I'm not wedded to the idea that this is right, meaning it's very, very hypothetical. But if they laid out their original plan for 140 house lots, that kind of thing, that's where it fits nicely within the overall distribution of, and where all the post holes are, the densest artifact concentrations, et cetera. Then there's an old spring down there in Chipley, kind of just off Chipley, and Chipley then is the actual street on top of what used to be a creek, which is why it floods all the time, I think. Anyway, the point is, we also see, I don't know if you noticed it, but there's a distribution of nails and wrought iron that's way down here, and it's all over the place down there, right next to the bayou. And there's a military concentration as well in there. There's a lot of shot. So we know that during the expedition, they actually built 2 new brigantines, 2 new small draft ships with oars that they could go up the rivers to central Alabama in. So where would they build ships in Pensacola? That was literally the first European style shipyard. My suspicion is it would be on Bayou Tahar. So I'm thinking that this distribution of artifacts that's kind of on the lower terrace down toward the bayou, maybe where they built their ships. I even found a contract where I actually got the pay record for the master shipbuilder who built them while he was here. He got paid in Mexico City. That's part of that new documentary load. All right, for you guys, this, by the way, these are some of the most recent master's theses that have been produced that deal specifically with the Luna settlement. So these are things that all post-date the discovery of the Luna settlement, and these are all available online. If you go to my website, and I have links for this, by the way, momentarily. So these are theses you can read that show some of the student work and analysis. But by the way, this does not include things that focus on the shipwrecks, mostly. So my point is there's lots more available on Luna. If you're interested in Luna research and Luna archaeology, there's tons available. So for you guys that live on the site, I wanted to point out this is an example soil profile. So if you look at this, there's yard fill in this case. So literally it's a low area in the site. And so it would have filled up with water a lot, but the previous owners probably filled it in with dirt. There's a buried humus layer. Then there's the Luna midden. Midden is a term we refer to for, organically enriched soil that has lots of artifacts in it. And then there's this subsoil down below, a transitional zone. So look at the numbers there. 70 centimeters is the entire depth of that profile. That's a little over 2 feet. So the entirety of the Luna trace, all of the evidence of Luna's expedition, the Luna settlement and everything, is sandwiched within the upper 2 feet of this site. And most of the artifacts are in the dark stuff up top. So literally within the first foot, 14 inches or so. So that gives you a sense, at least, of one of the reasons we like, we're trying to encourage people who own land out there. If you're about to do some sort of disturbance, we can come out and, help mitigate or at least look at things before something happens and at least learn something. But it's all very shallow. Here's another example. This is a post hole. Oh, here you go. So here you see the midden, the transitional zone, the subsoil, and then there's that nice dark post that goes way down. This one's almost to 90 centimeters, I think. So anyway, the point is post holes do extend deep, but most of the stuff is, again, within the first 2 feet. Actually, most of it's within the first foot. And then here's a trash pit that we found in 2016. That's 2 sides of the same. We cut a slot trench right through the middle of it. So you see big barrel bands, and you see a large smashed Native American pot and a thick midden on top, but then subsoil down below. So in other words, you have, well, I'll actually show you a better example right here. So in terms of takeaways for those who live on the site, like I said, most of the intact Luna midden artifacts are no deeper than 1 foot, 14 inches, something like that. Most of the post holes and pit features go no further down than about 2 feet and a little bit more. And anything that hasn't already been disturbed, like by a waterline trench or electrical cord, a ditch witch or something like that, or a footer dug for a house, anything in between all those disturbances, as we've found, are still intact. So post holes, shell middens, food debris, whatever is all still there. So you can see that schematic. The midden is the first foot, which has most of the artifacts. But below the midden, you get into subsoil, which is where we see post holes and pit features and things like that. But like I said, the vast majority of it, if you get in there with a backhoe or whatever and go down 2 feet, it's gone. That's it. So anyway, that's one of the dimensions. I wanted to show you, we were out there today, Christina and I were actually doing monitoring right today, and that's a house that went down over on Chipley. So anyway, we are still actively involved out there, and we really appreciate, you know, all of you coming to show your interest and hopefully support so that we can, you know, continue to learn things and share. By the way, all of this stuff, you know, what we learn, we share. I mean, that's part of public archaeology. We're state employees, you know, that we're paid by taxpayers, so we are responsible to get that information out. Oh yeah, and this is, Nicole, do you want to make, this is an upcoming talk just to invite you guys to participate with Dr. Bratton.
So I'll just mention really quickly, in the spirit of continuing to share all of the information that we can about Luna archaeology and Luna history here in our local area, we're hosting an Archaeology on Tap event on Thursday, December 5th at 7 o'clock. And this is going to be at Odd Colony Brewing Company down in downtown Pensacola. And Dr. John Bratton from the UWF Department of Anthropology is going to be sharing all of the information they've learned about the critters and the creatures of the Luna expedition as discovered on the shipwreck sites. This is going to be a really exciting presentation. We welcome you all to come join us then. Unfortunately, we won't be able to hold it hybrid for those of you who are joining us online. So you'll have to come in person for this one. But it's a great informal conversation and an opportunity to ask Dr. Bratton all of your burning questions about the shipwreck sites and the animals that were found discovered on those sites.
And what John has to talk about in that is actually very interesting, really nifty stuff. I think cats and rats and anyway, very neat stuff. Yes. And so for those of you who want to learn more, these are QR codes that'll lead you to all these various sites. So I've got my site that's basically one-stop shopping for learning about everything about the Luna expedition. We have a project blog we started in 2016, and so it's got entries sort of like quasi-academic, but just self-published articles that give details about Spanish life and Spanish pottery and a lot of other things that are not, you know, in many things. I've compiled a bibliography of kind of everything on the Luna expedition, published works, past works, present works, master's theses, and what is it? 67 conference papers from our university alone in the last 8 years, which is amazing. When I totaled it all up, I was amazed. And not all of them were from me. There are a lot of lot of students. Anyway, it's been phenomenal. And then at the end, you can see this is our kind of like signature article. You have to do it through JSTOR, not through JSTOR. You have to be a subscriber to, no, it is in JSTOR. Yeah. Anyway, the point is you may link on this and find that it says, oh, it's got a paywall behind it. If anybody wants to see that article and you can't get access to it, and by the way, you can go to the library and log on there and get any of it because we have our computers that are connected to it. But if you have a problem finding the article, it's an overview of discovering the site and learning about it. I'll send you a digital copy of it myself, or we'll get it out. So at that note, we're almost at our hour, but we have time for a few questions. So if anybody would have any questions, I'm kind of done. I only said what I thought would be useful. There's so much more information in there that we're still learning and already know. And anyway, questions, including online if anybody has any.
Well, I was curious about going back and forth to Veracruz. How long does it take by ship back then?
Wow. When they were coming here, it took very long time, like 60 days.
Yeah.
But I think that's about right. But once they started kind of going back and forth, as I understand, it's something on the order of a couple of weeks. Yeah. Yeah. So once they knew the route and the sailing signals, but when they first came to Pensacola, the only people that had come here to Ochuse Bay were during the DeSoto expedition. And they literally, the only way they knew how to do it was to go to a certain shoal off of the Yucatan Peninsula called Scorpion Shoals, Los Alacranes. And at that shoal, shoot straight north, due north, and then they would hit somewhere near Pensacola Bay. The first recon expedition ended up in Mississippi and ended up over toward Mobile. Luna ended up at Navarre Beach and then overshot Pensacola and also ended up in Mobile. Anyway, but once they figured it out, it's a couple weeks. Question?
Idea where you live?
Oh, on the site. I have a suspicion where the Luna lived. It's also where that little horsey came from. I think it's from the south. It's literally on the bluff where the University of West Florida has that parcel. I suspect, based on the artifact assemblage we have there, the amount of, I don't know, a lot of the high status ceramics, high status Aztec material, and high status, like that horse and other things. I suspect that Luna may have had his house right there in that area, either on that parcel or very close to it. I think the plaza, he would have been, he's the governor, he would be on the plaza, and then he'd have the plaza across him, and on the other side of his plaza would likely be the church, which we have yet to find. And then on the side of that would be royal officials. And in one of the yards, we found a little loaf-shaped piece of brass that's used to weigh gold. The only person who would have had something like that on the expedition, because they didn't come for gold, nor did they bring much gold, but was the treasurer of the expedition, who was, if somebody died on the expedition and they had a bit of gold jewelry, he had to have a set of weights to be able to weigh it all out and then liquidate it and sell it, right? So he'd had to record all that. So in other words, we found a coin, a weight for gold. So I think we have the treasurer's house in that vicinity, the plaza next to it, and then Luna's house, is my suspicion at least, is on that UWF parcel. But that's just a suspicion. Until we find like a little, I don't know, silver spoon that says Tristàn the Luna was here. But even then, you know, somebody could have taken it or he could have gotten mad and just, here, have my spoon, and it's gone. So we may never know for sure. If something like new documentation shows up, which actually is entirely possible, maybe somebody actually wrote about it. I have texts that say, oh, you know, the royal officials went across the plaza and went to Don Tristàn's house. So I know he had a house. I just can't say exactly where it was. Archaeology can go so far and documents can go so far. But in the case of Luna like this, yeah, we have a lot of both, but in some cases, mysteries will never be solved. I like to think that Luna would go out and, you know, have his morning atole or whatever on the bluff overlooking the wrecked ships that would ruin his career.
There's lots of diaries and letters that talk about the problem with starvation. Many of the people died of starvation. Soldiers were chewing the leather. I think there was some of the comments about how eating acorns and getting sick. With all the bounties of the sea, there had to also be small animals and even larger animals in the area. Why was that not available?
Well, what you're talking about, I'm not sure if you guys online can hear the question, but it was about the accounts of starvation, eating boiled shoes, things like that, and people dying from starvation. That all of those, literally the only accounts that that detail that come from a book published in 1596 by a Dominican named, well, Agustin, anyway, his last name is Davila Padilla. He was a Dominican head, and he had as one of his predecessors, Domingo de la Anunciación, who was a member of the Luna expedition. Anyway, the point is that that passage was written by one of the Dominicans. And when he talks about the starvation and the boiling of the shoes, it's when Luna brought all of the people who were at Pensacola inland, and they had a cattle drive. The first cattle drive in this area was on the Luna expedition. They brought all the people, some of them by boat, but most of them by land. And as they were marching north toward Nanipacana, which is this as yet unlocated archaeological site, a native town, that's when they started to run out of food on the trail. And then when they got up there, they found that the native people had pulled away all of the food that they had originally thought they would acquire, purchase. And that's where they learned to boil acorns, to process acorns. They actually learned how to do that up there. They even talk about going around and finding weeds. They didn't know what they were and boiling them. And then some people died, like a woman specifically died. So here's the thing. When they moved inland, there's definitely accounts of starvation. In fact, it got so bad that they apparently slaughtered all their horses and ate them, you know, so they didn't have anything left. Well, what they say in one of the letters in the interior is that they're starving so much that please, can we go down to the coast so we can get palmetto berries, fish, crabs, and shellfish. So they literally, in the document, all those married soldiers and the Aztecs and all that are saying, please let us abandon this place. We want to go to Mobile Bay. And eventually they did go to Mobile Bay, and they stayed about 2 weeks, and then they just came back here. So that's part of it. But I also found service records from soldiers who were on the expedition who later bought a whole bunch of their war buddies together to prove how heroic, you know, they were and get a pension or something like that. Anyway, one of the service records I found says that the treasurer, the guy who actually may have owned that little piece of the weight from the balance scale, that he appointed, there were a team of 4 guys who would go out with arquebuses. Well, they didn't say what they used. Maybe it was crossbows, but anyway, they would go out and hunt deer. And I have the name, Pedro de Acuña was one of the captains, and he led the group that would go around and they hunted deer. And they when they got it back, they would distribute it to people at 1 pound per person. So they tried to ration the deer meat. And ironically, when I was learning all this in our first season, we found that big trash pit. At the very bottom of that trash pit, which was full of broken pots and the little silver star and all this other big barrel bands, at the very bottom of the pot, or the pit rather, we found a deer antler, which had been cut. So the point is, it was a deer antler right at the bottom. So it's evidence, at least direct evidence, of them having hunted deer and brought them back. So we also, though, like I say, we've found stuff that's not in the documents. We've actually found their meals, the remnants of their meals in the shellfish and in the fish. So what you're saying is accurate. In other words, why didn't they exploit the marine or aquatic resources? Well, apparently by the time they got back down here, they basically either learned to do so or relented, having resisted before. I can tell you that at this time period, at least, Spanish people would almost rather starve than eat vermin and, you know, things that were not civilized, like Indian food, things like that. No, I mean, I'm just saying that's when you read the account. So what we call it in anthropology is cultural starvation. So in other words, they almost like they let themselves starve to death because they, number one, don't know how to prepare other foods, but also it's because they miss the foods that they consider actually food. I mean, like, for example, we could all, if we don't have any food, we could eat insects, worms. How many of us would choose not to? No, I mean, I'm just thinking about it. So that's sort of the perspective I have on it. So anyway, your point is excellent. And actually the thesis that's going to look at this meal deposit or multiple meal deposit is going to give us some insight into what they actually ate, because they may not have written about it because they were ashamed of it. So we don't know what they ate, but we're going to find what they ate because we see their garbage. Kind of neat, actually, now that I think about it. Any other questions?
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. One from Mike Toman, who is asking, can you tell us more about the documents you recently discovered that you mentioned?
Yes. I thought I had something in here and I may have skipped over it in the hurry, but I have a chart that shows the Army. Hold on, let me go back. Where is it? Yep, there it is. There it is. All right, so I found the pay. Basically, what I found was, up to now, we've had the treasury accounts for the deputy treasurers of New Spain living in Veracruz. We've had hundreds of pages of accounts. And so up to now, I and others have done research on these accounts. So those are the monies paid by the crown in Veracruz, Mexico, to build the ships and prepare the ships and send the people to Florida. We've never had the accounts from Mexico City, where they actually mounted the expedition, where they bought all their supplies and brought everything down. But through years and years of thinking about it, we eventually got money from the state for a big grant. And part of that money, we paid a consultant. And I told the consultant, I want you to check this legajo, this bundle of documents in Spain, which was, anyway, it's a long story, but the point is we found the actual Mexico City accounts. So a third of the total money on the expedition, which I think was 600,000 pesos, was a lot of money in that time. A third of the accounts we already had. Now we have 2/3 of we have the rest of the accounts. So one of the accounts I have here is every cavalry and infantry company. I know exactly how many people they had, how much they were paid. Also, every one of these people, this is literally the people that were on the expedition. We know now, for example, that the cavalry companies typically had 36 people. The infantry companies had typically 51. There were a few exceptions to that. I have the names of a lot of these people. Also, and I don't have this in the presentation, but I have bonuses paid to each individual who had a special skill. So cavalry guys would get 150 pesos as a signing bonus. They didn't get salary, they just got that bonus and they were sent. And then if they stayed here, they would eventually end up landowners, right? And they would make money that way. So anyway, 150 for the cavalry, 50 or 100 for the infantry. What it turns out that if they had additional skills like a cobbler, a shoemaker, a blacksmith, a saddle maker. I mean, and so what I found is a list now of all the payments, each individual payment to each individual, and some of them had multiple skills, but they would get 50 extra pesos for that. Plus, I've got families that were paid, married soldiers that would bring their families. So they were paid an additional 50 pesos, I think. So you were incentivized if you had skills or if you brought your family with you, which wasn't a good idea in the end because the more mouths they had to feed that weren't producing anything in terms of like helping the expedition, you know, they ended up without the food. They originally came with a full year's worth of food, but of course, because they didn't want to have to rely on the Native Americans, because by this time the Spanish were not into conquering, they were into negotiating and trying to convert. 1542, 43, the Spanish changed their laws, and so Luna came in a new environment. But anyway, the point is, the new documents I have include all of these detailed pay records. I have the receipt list for every item built or bought for the expedition by the Dominicans. So I can literally tell you the exact amount of red fabric, purple fabric, white fabric, needles, all the candlesticks that they brought, everything. And I know exactly how much they all cost. It's just phenomenal amount of information. Gosh, there's so much more. Oh, and what we had was shipping records for all the food, meaning it would say I shipped, you know, so-and-so shipped from Mexico City down to Jalapa and then to Veracruz, so-and-so many pounds of corn. I've actually got the purchase records for which village in central Mexico they actually bought these from. So I've got the wheat, the corn, all the various foodstuffs, the purchase records. So I'm just going through this, you know, it's a vast amount of material, and I haven't had time to go through all of it. It's several hundred pages. But like I say, no previous Luna scholar has ever had access to this document for some reason. So I feel uniquely blessed to be able to actually, you know, do something with it. So we're going to basically try to I have already transcribed most of it, but we're going to try to put that out as like some sort of an appendix. Translating it's a whole nother matter. Translating slow, and I kind of hate it, but because I don't even use my own translations. I work from the original Spanish. Once you translate something, you fix it in a meaning that disallows your ability to see the ambiguity in the original text. So decisions you make as a translator may be wrong, subtleties. So I want to read the original. So I do books of translation, but it takes a long time to make it read well. Because if you read it, translate it accurately, like precisely, it makes them come off like idiots, like they can't speak. So I have to make it smooth and whatever. And so it takes a long time. So we'll see, that'll be a project. But anyway, the point is for Mike's, in answer to Mike's question, it's basically all the financial expenses related to assembling Luna's expedition that we didn't have. It's like the last 2/3 of the money. We now know where it all went, including lots of, you know, details about the army that we never knew before. I only had to guess previously about the size of the companies. Now I know to the man exactly how many we had. So someday, maybe I can say where each one of these companies might have camped in y'all's yards. Maybe. Maybe. Anyway, yeah.
I love the slides that show the dispersal of everything and all the different categories. Do they exist somewhere with an overlay of today's streets and property boundaries?
I know because I deliberately did it not that way because I kind of, because of the broad nature of the audience, I want to maintain the privacy of the landowners. And so I deliberately didn't put any property boundaries and made the topographic map, you know, kind of vague. So I guess the point is I'm trying to, now individual landowners, if you want to come see me and whatever, that's fine. But in terms of general consumption, I'm trying to make sure that, you know, that the privacy and that we respect the neighborhood. So it was deliberate not to put that in
I
there.
just want to know how careful I need to be doing projects and.
Well, no, and that's
out there, then okay, I maybe won't be as careful.
Well, and that's the thing. No, and I really appreciate that. And honestly, this is almost like the start of where I could put together a best practices we could put together a best practices sort of like little guide thing for people who live on the Luna site. Just things to think about. You know, and all of this is completely voluntary, right? I mean, this is y'all's property and we would like you to take pride in the Luna expedition. And obviously those of you who are here do, but you may not know like that the first foot is where all the stuff is, the first 2 feet. And so, yeah, we could maybe advise you guys. And if you have individual questions, certainly come to us. If you're on the margins of the site, see, the thing is that all the dense areas on those maps that we saw, all those dense areas are, of course, where much of the action was. But the edges of the site might be also just as interesting. So for example, did they put the Aztec craftspeople out in one little corner of the site? What about the common everyday soldiers? What about men with families who weren't particularly wealthy? There may be parts of the site that were only lived on for a very short time, like those first 6 months, and then they eventually consolidated, or maybe they left. But because it's an ephemeral occupation at the edge of the site, and it might be people that aren't well documented and well known archaeologically, that makes it actually important to get samples from the least dense areas of the site. So does that make sense? So I don't know, it's kind of all important in a sense. We don't even know if they built like a stockade at all. I don't think they did. There's no reference to it, but we did an excavation 2018 in the wintertime. We did a trench across one lot just to see if we could catch maybe a stockade line, you know, like where they had a wall. We didn't find anything like that. But we might. And the corral for the horses, what did that look like? I'd love to see that. So edges of the site might be just as important. And remember, they built the ships, I think, way down there on the bayou, way away from where people lived. But I don't think anyone's excavated a 16th century shipyard in the New World. I could be wrong. It was definitely the first European style shipyard in Pensacola. So it would be very cool to get traces of that. And that's in an area of the site that's not the splashy, full of good stuff part of the site, but it might have clues that are super important. So not everything is going to be equally important, but still, I'm just eager and excited to learn more. So I will happily respond to questions, and I'm sure we can work out systems where maybe we can get like written stuff that'll help. So I'm not literally, having to repeat the same thing a million times, but I will do it if it takes it. I'll help however I can. Yes.
Do they think there's any treasure like in the ships?
No, I mean, basically these ships were cargo ships. They were bringing, literally they were bringing colonists, they were bringing food. Some of them were going to go to Spain, but they were too filled to bring any. So none of them were, absolutely none of them were treasure ships. There are ships that were being brought back full of stuff, but they took a different route. So these ships, literally the only thing one would ever find anywhere on the site like this would be literally pocket change. Pay for the soldiers, petty cash account, that kind of stuff. So, but the vast majority of that stuff they would have kept, they would have taken with them. So we don't find a lot of that stuff, which is good because, treasure attracts treasure hunters, and treasure hunters tend not to take care in their excavations, nor do treasure hunters often adhere to legal restrictions like, I don't know, trespass. I say that anyway. Treasure hunters obviously have a sort of an antagonistic relationship from archaeological standpoint, just because, they're taking for themselves what I would think at least is part of our shared human heritage. It belongs in a museum, to quote Indiana Jones.
Did somebody donate that property to UWF that y'all have?
Yes, more or less. Basically, it was a donation to the foundation in order to be able to purchase the land, in order to preserve it, basically make it a preserve for, in perpetuity. And a nice little open space that allows the breeze to get into the inside of the neighborhood now. At least that wasn't lost on me when I was out there. Any other questions? Jennifer, you said something about maybe more.
Yeah, I've got another one online. Can you talk briefly about what the native pottery you're finding is?
It's all Bear Point phase Pensacola pottery. Pensacola is an archaeological culture, so it's all basically mostly plain pottery with incised decoration. Little scroll, like bowls and scroll work made with just little either feathers or little dowels or something like that. And so, and almost no stamped, paddle stamp designs. It's basically all local level, or almost all local level, what we call Pensacola style pottery. We do have a few pieces from central Alabama, meaning we have pieces of pottery that don't belong here. They belong literally up near Montgomery and Selma and that part of Alabama. And the reason for that, it's real simple. Remember I told you that the Luna colony moved inland to central Alabama and they started to starve? Well, they sent soldiers out on horseback and on boat, and that's where they were ravaging the countryside. So some of the pots that they acquired in central Alabama probably made their way onto the boats and eventually back to Pensacola. And so we find pottery that is stylistically, at least, from central Alabama. Now, did the Native Americans in Pensacola Bay prehistorically trade with the people in central Alabama and maybe get their own actual Alabama-made pots without the agency of the Spaniards? Probably, right? So in other words, I can't say for sure that this pot was brought back to Pensacola in the Luna expedition. I mean, I suspect it, for example. We even found one nifty little, oh, I love this piece, teeny tiny little black chert arrow point. And I mean, like one of the smallest arrow points I've ever found. And of course, I don't find anything. All my students find it. I just kind of pick it up and say, "Ooh, look what I found." Anyway, I had my time in the sun as a young archaeologist. Anyway, I get to be the professor now. Anyway, this is a neat little black chert arrow point. And the point is the chert, the material it's made from, is from Northwest Alabama, Northwest Georgia, Northeast Alabama. It's Fort Payne chert. At least I think that's what it is. Anyway, the point is it's not local, and we don't find that kind of arrowhead here. And in my mind, at least, it was a souvenir, maybe when the people that went up to Coosa, which is where that stuff is local, it could be that, an arrow ended up getting shot into a saddlebag and stuck in a saddlebag, or maybe even somebody's posterior. And the point is they ended up bringing it back as a souvenir or something. So we've got an in deep interior Ridge and Valley chert arrow point at the Luna site, which I think is most likely to be a direct result of the soldiers being up in Coosa. Because I lived in Coosa. I literally worked in the Coosa province back in 1998 through 2001, ironically, and I ended up going back to moving to Pensacola much later. But anyway, I worked in that area, and so that arrow point fits nicely as a spot, something of the Coosa province. Any other questions? We're kind of over time, I think, a little bit, but how about Jennifer? Do you have anything?
The only other one is, you've already sort of touched on it, but Pax would like to know if there's anything more about food in the new documents.
Tons about food, but it's all grains, starchy foods. I have tons of records about wheat purchases and corn, but I haven't been through everything. So there might be some little isolated purchases, but all the meats, proteins that they would have brought would have been in dried form, salted. So salted beef, salted pork, and cheese, because these were Catholic. And so in other words, they wouldn't eat meat. They would bring salted fish, but I think they expected to catch fish. So whenever they had a Lenten day of abstinence, when they couldn't eat meat, they would typically, the Spanish sailors, for example, would eat cheese, big wheels of Manchego cheese, which sounds pretty tasty right now. Anyway, they would bring that as a supply. So yeah, we have some purchase records from that, but anyway, so I do have some information about foodways that I'm still compiling. If I ever have time, I can finish all these things. I keep wanting to train students to learn to read the handwriting, and therefore they can then take up, and I have had quite a bit of success at that. So I can have some help, turning these things into actual typed transcriptions that anyone who speaks Spanish can read. Even medieval Spanish is not that far from modern Spanish. Just some of the vocabulary is weird, because a lot of things that were around in Luna's time, nobody uses anymore. So there isn't a word for that now. So, all right, any other questions? We good? All right, thank you all so much.